It was the kind of night that seemed too quiet for the city, the kind of stillness that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. And somewhere inside a marble-covered skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the cold glow of the moon, a secret sat locked away, one that could ruin one of the most powerful men in the world if it ever reached the light. A secret that for years had been buried under layers of lies, money, and fear. But tonight the first crack in that wall would begin, and it would begin because of a woman no one in that building thought mattered. A woman whose name they never bothered to remember, whose footsteps on their polished floors were silent enough to be ignored, yet whose eyes had seen everything they thought she was blind to, whose hands had wiped away the traces of nights they hoped no one could piece together, and whose memory, sharper than any security camera, had kept every detail intact, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be a danger to keep but a weapon to wield. Her name was Elise Carter, and for the past 7 years she had been a maid in the service of billionaire magnate Donovan Hale, a man whose empire stretched across continents and industries, whose smile could charm investors into signing away fortunes, but whose private life was a labyrinth of shadows where people disappeared, careers ended overnight, and those who asked the wrong questions never asked again. And though she had been dismissed in his eyes as invisible, Elise had been there the night everything changed, the night that even Donovan couldn't buy back from memory, the night that, if the world heard about it, would shatter him forever. That night had been 3 years ago, and Elise could still smell the metallic tang of the air in the east wing of Hale Tower, where Donovan held his most secret gatherings, a smell that wasn't from the champagne or imported cigars, but something darker, something raw, a scent that mixed with the muffled sounds coming from behind a heavy oak door. She was never supposed to open, a door she only approached because she had been sent to replace an empty ice bucket. And yet, when she reached it, she realized it wasn't latched, that a faint sliver of light spilled into the hall, and curiosity, that dangerous ember she had been taught all her life to smother, flared against her better judgment. She nudged it just enough to see inside, and in that instant her entire life's direction shifted, because what she saw wasn't the usual drunken laughter or whispered deals, but Donovan himself, sleeves rolled up, face cold, standing over a man bound to a chair, a man whose face was bloodied and barely conscious, with 2 others flanking Donovan like shadows, one holding a ledger thick with documents, the other holding a small black device blinking red. And Elise froze, ice creeping through her veins, until Donovan's voice cut the air like glass, low but dangerous, saying something about making sure this was erased tonight. And that word, erased, stuck in her mind like a hook, and she knew she was looking at something that could never be unseen. She backed away before the door could creak, holding her breath until she reached the elevator, and though she went home that night without a word, the image followed her into her dreams, refusing to fade, whispering that she had just witnessed the billionaire's darkest night. For 3 years she kept that secret locked in her chest, not because she wanted to protect Donovan, but because she knew how his world worked. She had seen what happened to people who became inconvenient. She had scrubbed their offices clean, packed up their things when they never returned, heard the stories in whispers from the other maids, and she knew if she went to the police with nothing but her word, she'd be discredited or worse. But the night she decided she couldn't stay silent anymore came suddenly, without warning, when a headline lit up every phone screen in the city. Prominent whistleblower found dead in apparent accident. And Elise recognized the man instantly. It was the same man she had seen tied to that chair in Hale Tower, and his death, framed as an accident, was the push she had been dreading and yet waiting for. Because now the truth wasn't just a secret, it was justice denied. And something inside her hardened into resolve. She would no longer be the silent maid in the background. She would become the voice that could bring him down, but to do that, she would need more than memory. She would need proof, and that meant going back into Hale Tower one last time, knowing it could cost her everything. The night Elise decided to act, the city was soaked in rain, the kind that blurred neon signs into watercolor smears and made the streets glisten like wet steel. And as she stood at the corner opposite Hale Tower, her hood pulled low, and her heart drumming a steady warning, she felt the weight of every step she was about to take, because this wasn't just cleaning a floor or wiping fingerprints off a desk. This was stepping into the kind of danger that didn't give second chances. But she had learned over the years that fear and courage often walked hand in hand, and tonight courage had finally pulled ahead. So she waited until the shift change at the lobby desk before walking through the revolving doors with the casual stride of someone who belonged. Because in a way, she did. Hale's staff were used to seeing her, and their eyes slid over her without interest, the same way they always had, not realizing that invisibility was the greatest gift she could have in this moment. She swiped the backup keycard she'd quietly kept after leaving the job, feeling the tiny click of access, and then she was inside, swallowed by the quiet hum of the tower at night. The plan was simple in theory, but deadly in practice. Get into the East Wing's restricted archive, the same place she'd seen the man tied to the chair 3 years ago, and find anything that linked Donovan Hale to the incident and the whistleblowers. Recent death. But simple plans had a way of twisting when confronted with reality. And she knew the cameras weren't her only concern, because Donovan had a way of making you feel watched even when he wasn't in the building, a presence that lingered like the aftertaste of smoke, so she moved quickly but deliberately, pushing her cart, loaded with a few cleaning supplies for cover, down the gleaming corridor, every step echoing against glass and steel, until she reached the service elevator that could take her up to the 32nd floor, where the East Wing sat like a fortress within the tower. She keyed in the code she'd memorized years ago, praying it hadn't been changed. And when the doors slid open with a soft chime, her breath caught. It still worked. The East Wing at night felt different. Heavier, as if the air here had been stitched with the secrets of the powerful. And Elise's footsteps seemed to vanish into the thick carpet as she approached the oak door again, the same one from that night, but now reinforced with a biometric scanner. Proof that Donovan was guarding something worth protecting. She glanced at the keypad and knew she'd need a different route, so she moved further down the hall to the maintenance access panel she had once seen left ajar during renovations. Crouched low and with a twist of her wrist, she pried it open, the sound muted by the rain still pounding against the glass walls. Inside the narrow space was dark and smelled faintly of dust and electrical wiring, but it bypassed the scanner, leading her into the heart of the East Wing's archive. A room lined with locked cabinets, metal cases, and a single desk with a sleek black laptop glowing faintly in the dark. Elise slipped on the gloves she'd brought and went straight for the desk, powering the laptop awake, but it demanded a password, and though she didn't have one, she had something better. A small flash drive loaded with a program her cousin, a quiet but brilliant IT technician, had given her when she told him she needed to recover some old files. He hadn't asked questions, but the look in his eyes told her he suspected more. She plugged it in, watching as the code began unraveling. The system's defenses, each second feeling like an hour, until finally the folders opened before her. And there it was, labeled only with a date she knew all too well, the date of the night she'd peeked through that oak door. Her hands trembled as she clicked it open, revealing not just documents and ledgers, but grainy security footage from inside the room, footage that showed Donovan, the bound man, and the 2 shadows flanking him, footage that, if released, would obliterate his empire overnight. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she knew she couldn't just take this and walk out. Donovan would realize almost immediately what was missing, so she copied the files, encrypted them with her cousin's software, and left a subtle digital decoy behind that would delay anyone noticing the breach. But just as she was about to pull the flash drive free, she heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the main entrance to the archive. She froze, every muscle taut, listening as the steps drew closer. A man's voice, low and unfamiliar, said something into a radio, and she realized this wasn't the usual security. Donovan had private guards patrolling this floor tonight, and if they found her here, there would be no way to explain her presence, no story she could spin that would save her. So she slid into the shadows behind a tall cabinet, holding her breath as the door opened and two men stepped inside, scanning the room with sharp, restless eyes. The two guards moved with the slow certainty of men who knew they didn't have to hurry, because whoever they were looking for had nowhere to run, their boots sinking into the carpet with muffled thuds, the faint click of their earpieces breaking. The silence as one murmured, "Clear so far," and Elise felt the sweat prickling at the base of her neck. Every instinct screaming at her to run, but knowing that movement would betray her, she pressed herself deeper into the shadow cast by the cabinet, forcing her breathing into shallow, quiet bursts, while her mind raced through escape routes. None of them good. The taller guard stepped closer to the desk, his flashlight beam sweeping across the surface. Stopping for a second too long on the faint imprint of her gloved hands near the keyboard, he frowned and leaned in, and Elise knew she had seconds before suspicion turned into alarm, so she slid her fingers to the edge of the maintenance panel. She'd come through and began easing it open millimeter by millimeter, praying the sound would be swallowed by the rain hammering against the building's windows. The moment the panel gave way, she slipped through, her movements careful but swift, pulling it shut behind her, and began crawling through the narrow maintenance corridor. Her knees hitting the metal grating as she moved, the flashlights behind her flickered briefly against the panel she'd just closed, followed by the muffled sound of voices, short, sharp, urgent. And she knew they'd realized something wasn't right. Her heart slammed against her ribs. But she kept going, every movement deliberate, until she reached the junction that split. Toward the freight elevator, she chose the left path, which would take her to the stairwell exit 2 floors below, the one she'd scouted weeks ago during a harmless daytime visit to the building. Her mind replayed every step of her plan, adjusting, on the fly, because now it wasn't just about getting the files out. It was about getting out alive. She reached the stairwell and eased the heavy fire door open, peeking through the narrow gap, empty, except for the hum of the emergency lights. But as she stepped inside, her foot landed in a shallow puddle. The sound magnified in the enclosed space, and she froze, tilting her head upward to hear faint footsteps above, steady and deliberate, matching her pace. She realized they weren't just searching randomly. They were tracking her. Maybe through cameras, maybe through sensors she didn't know about, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine. She tightened her grip on the flash drive in her pocket and began descending faster, skipping steps, until the stairwell turned into a blur of steel and shadows, the rain's roar outside growing louder as she neared the ground floor. When she pushed through the final door into the underground loading dock, she was hit with the scent of wet concrete and diesel, the wide space dimly lit by overhead lamps, a truck engine rumbling somewhere at the far end. She kept to the shadows, weaving between pallets and crates, aiming for the narrow service exit that led to an alley behind Hale Tower. But as she reached for the handle, a deep voice called out. Behind her, calm and cold, "You're a long way from the cleaning crew, Miss Parker." And the name froze her blood because she hadn't heard it in years. Not since Donovan had said it himself in that quiet, dangerous tone the night she'd stumbled into the Oak Room. She turned slowly to see a man in a black coat, tall, with the kind of stillness that spoke of control and violence, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. And though he wasn't Donovan, there was no doubt in her mind that he was speaking for him. He took a step closer, his hands in his pockets, voice even. "I think you have something that belongs to Mr. Hale." And Elise's mind raced, weighing the odds. If she handed over the drive, she might walk away tonight, but everything she'd risked would be for nothing. If she ran, she might not. Make it 10 feet before a bullet found her, but then she remembered something her cousin had told her when he gave her the flash drive's encryption. Even if they get it, They can't use it without you unlocking it, and that thought gave her just enough steel to look the man in the eye and say, if it belonged to him, he'd still have it. The faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face before his jaw tightened, and in that moment, the distant hiss of hydraulic brakes echoed through the dock as a delivery truck pulled in, blocking his line of sight for a split second. Just enough for Elise to bolt through the service exit and into the rain-slick alley beyond. The alley was a tunnel of shadows, the rain stinging her face as she ran, her footsteps splashing in puddles, her breath ragged. She didn't stop until she'd crossed 3 blocks and ducked into the back entrance of a 24-hour laundromat. The hum of dryers and the smell of detergent wrapping around her like a shield, she slid into a corner booth, pulling out her phone, and sent a single coded message to her cousin. It's done. Phase 2 starts now, and as she stared at the flash drive in her hand, the weight of what she'd taken settled over her. Donovan Hale would not just come for her now, he would come for everything she loved. But for the first time in years, Elise wasn't afraid, because she knew the truth had a way of burning through even the darkest nights. The news broke before sunrise, the city still shrouded in a gray mist when the first whispers began to spread across encrypted chat rooms, anonymous forums, and the darker corners of the web. Files from inside Hale Global had been stolen, files that spoke of deals made in blood and shadow, but no one knew who had them, and Donovan Hale's inner circle moved like a silent storm, shutting down leaks, scrubbing mentions, deploying lawyers and private operatives with unlimited budgets. Yet the name Elise Parker had already surfaced in places it was never supposed. 2 tucked inside encrypted emails, hidden in metadata like a ghost leaving traces for those who knew where to look. Donovan sat in his penthouse office, the skyline behind him a smear of silver under the rain, his hands clasped on the desk, the faint tremor in his jaw, the only sign of fury as he listened to his head of security report. We've locked down the accounts and locked out our people from talking, but she's not using her own name, sir. She's 3 steps ahead on every trace. This isn't just some maid who got lucky. Donovan's eyes narrowed. The memory of her standing in the Oak Room years ago surfacing unbidden, her hands trembling as she cleaned a crystal decanter, her gaze flicking to him for only a moment before dropping away, the faintest trace of defiance in that single glance. He hadn't recognized it then, but now he knew it for what it was. She was watching even then, he murmured, almost to himself, and the thought didn't anger him as much as it intrigued him. He leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Then we make the city small for her. Every street, every face. She breathes, we'll know." And so the net began to close. Cameras in subway tunnels flickered to life. Drones patrolled alleys where rain pooled like oil. Men in unmarked cars lingered at corners, their eyes hidden behind tinted glass. Elise felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in the way people moved around her, the lingering stares from strangers, the low hum of a car engine that followed, her half a block longer than it should have. She had learned long ago to listen to the air around her, and tonight it was thick, heavy, dangerous. She ducked into a crowded cafe, sliding into a back table and pulling her hood low, the steam from the coffee machine blurring the glass just enough to hide her from the street. Her cousin's voice came through her earpiece, tight with urgency. "They've activated a sweep grid. You've got maybe 20 minutes before your area's hot." Elise sipped the bitter coffee, thinking 20 minutes wasn't enough to run, but it was enough to make her next move. She left the cafe through the kitchen, slipping into a side alley where the rain slicked bricks to a mirror sheen. From her bag, she pulled a burner laptop, its casing scratched, its ports taped. Sitting on an overturned crate under the hiss of a flickering street lamp, she connected to a shadow server and began uploading fragments of the stolen files. Not the whole thing, just enough to make Hale bleed in the public eye. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, emails about asset disposal that didn't read like corporate mergers but something far darker. She knew the effect would be immediate. Donovan's people would see the leak, and panic would tighten their movements, make them sloppy. The first wave of chaos hit faster than she expected. News alerts flashing on her phone about unverified claims tied to Hale Global. Reporters swarming the company's lobby, investors calling for emergency board meetings. Donovan watched from his office as the stock price dipped, his expression unreadable, then turned to his aide and said, "She's not trying to destroy me yet. She's baiting me." And he was right. Elise was forcing him to make a move, to step out of the shadows where he felt safe, because the real file, the one that would burn him down completely, was still in her possession. By nightfall, the streets felt tighter. Checkpoints appeared where none had been that morning. Patrols swept through markets, train stations, even laundromats. Elise switched locations twice, once slipping into a theater crowd, once hiding in a freight elevator with delivery workers. But the third time, she wasn't fast enough. She felt the shift in the crowd, the way it parted ahead of her, and saw the tall man in the black coat from the loading dock step into view, his eyes locking on hers through the sea of faces. She turned sharply, heart pounding, shoving through the press of bodies until she burst into a side street. She didn't stop running until she reached the river. The water churned dark and fast under the bridge, the air thick with the smell of rain and diesel. Her phone buzzed, her cousin again, this time only one word. "They're close." And then, almost as if to confirm it, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the wet concrete. Elise gripped the flash drive in her pocket, the cold metal grounding her. This wasn't the end game, but it was close, and she could feel it, in the way the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere behind her, Donovan Hale was moving closer, not just with his men, but himself. The sound of his footsteps was unlike the others, measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had never once rushed for anyone in his life. Elise stayed still at the edge of the bridge, the cold mist from the river rising around her, like smoke, her breath slow and even as if she were preparing for something inevitable. The city's hum felt distant, muffled under the drum of the rain. When Donovan stepped into view, the lamplight caught the sharp edges of his face, his coat, dark against the shimmer of water behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years collapsed into a single moment, her in the maid's uniform, him with the glass of whiskey in hand, and the unspoken knowledge that he had taken something from her that night, something he could never give back. "You've caused me trouble," he said at last, his voice low, almost calm, though she could hear the strain in it. "You've cost me millions, friends, influence." He took a step closer, water beating on his shoulders. "But you haven't finished me." Elise tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "Not yet," she said quietly, her fingers tightening on the flash drive in her pocket. "You don't get to walk away this time." He almost smiled at that, a flash of amusement in the middle of the tension. "You think you can destroy me with a few stolen files? I've buried worse." Elise stepped forward now, closing the saw. Space between them until the sound of the river drowned out everything else. "This isn't about files," she said, her voice steady. "It's about the people you left to die. It's about that night." The flicker in his eyes told her she'd hit the mark. That night. The one no one else dared mention. The one that had left a trail of blood in a remote estate far from the city lights, disguised as an accident, but written in the hidden corners of his empire's records. She had been there, not in the room, but in the shadows, cleaning the hallway, outside when the shouting started. She had seen the man leave, pale and shaking, and she had seen the way Donovan had ordered the mess cleaned up, the way his voice never wavered as he decided who would live and who would disappear. "You don't have proof," he said now. But there was a hitch in his voice, the first crack she had ever heard. Elise took the flash drive out of her pocket, holding it between her fingers like a blade. "This is proof enough. And it's not the only copy. She stepped back, her foot finding the slick metal of the bridge railing. The rain plastered, her hair to her face, and in that moment she looked almost otherworldly, as if she belonged to the storm. You can't buy me off. You can't erase me. You can't touch me without making the truth louder. The tension between them snapped. All at once, when headlights swung into the street, Hale's men spilling out into the rain. Donovan raised a hand to stop them, his eyes locked on hers. "You walk away now," he said, "and I let you live." Elise let the smallest smile touch her lips. "You still don't get it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I already won." And then she was gone, slipping into the shadows beneath the bridge, the roar of the river swallowing her as the flash drive's data uploaded to servers across the world. Within minutes, reporters, activists, and governments would have the truth. Donovan Hale stood in the rain, the city lights flickering in the distance, realizing for the first time in his life that he could not stop what was coming. It would be called the darkest night in headlines, a reckoning no amount of money could bury. And in every telling of it, there was always one name whispered with a mix of awe and defiance: Elise Parker, the maid who faced the giant and walked away with her truth intact.